Hey, my name is Lester Spence. I sincerely apologize for not being able to be with you physically. Unfortunately, my travel arrangements didn't allow me to basically get back to Baltimore and serve as chair and discussant physically simultaneously. So, what I'm going to do, given that this is the 21st century, is I'm going to try to uh, moderate, so to speak, from afar. Um, so, quick organizing side note: I'm imagining all of you have one of these. So, as opposed to someone giving you kind of like time signals, like a sign, like 5 minutes left, like 2 minutes left, like 3 minutes left, whatever, I suggest that in lieu of having a chair serve that function, you basically time yourselves. You've got three papers and an hour and 45 minutes. So I'd imagine that you have a little bit of time to flesh your works out. So maybe time yourselves for approximately 15 to 17 minutes. As an aside, I think for those of you who don't necessarily do that, it's kind of a good habit to build up so you can actually have a sense of how to do that on your own. Um, More broadly, I want to speak really quickly about these papers in as part of kind of a larger suite of policing panels that Law and Society has had. I've had the opportunity to attend a number of them on Friday, and then I had a sense of some of the other panels that happened on Thursday. What I think the works in this panel, what the works in this panel does, it provides kind of a critical perspective that we both need in the policing literature more broadly, that we need in the social sciences that are beginning to think about policing. I know, at least in political science's case, we haven't really taken police seriously for maybe 30, 40 years. Um, but also, more specifically, within the suite of panels that we actually have here at Law Society. What I've seen is the panels in general kind of take kind of a liberal slash moderate reformist approach to policing. And while I think that gets us something, I think we also need a far more critical approach, an approach that's kind of attuned to political economy, that's an approach that's attuned to racial politics, both in the United States and in other cases, and that thinks about police as an agent of social control as opposed to an agent that's supposed to kind of help us problem solve crime. So I really wish that I could be here with you to kind of talk through these papers because I think they're absolutely wonderful. What I'm going to do now is actually, you know what? So I need you guys to do me a favor. Pause this, then you do your papers. I suggest present them in the order they are in the book. First, Laurel Eckhouse from the University of Denver, Descriptive Representation of Political Power, Explaining Racial Inequalities in Policing. Then we have Ayobami Lanianu, Police, Politics, and Demobilization, Exploring Policy Feedbacks in Britain. As an aside, Ayo's paper won the Best Paper Award this year, I believe. Congratulations. And then finally, we have Imelda Gonzalez, Resilience or Repression, Approaches to Participatory Security in Two Latin American Cities. Now, what I'd like you guys to do is pause, present the papers, and then after you're done presenting the papers, come back to me. And then what I'll do is I'll provide the comments that I've written down basically on each of the papers, and I'm going to deal with them in turn. Okay, what we're first going to do is go to Laurel Eckhart's paper on descriptive representation and political power. I think this paper is absolutely wonderful. I will just make a couple of different suggestions. Um, First, it's important to note that cities actually differ institutionally in America. And one way they differ institutionally is by the strength of their city council. There are cities that have strong mayors and weak city councils. Baltimore, for example, is one of them. And then there are cities that have relatively weak mayors and stronger city councils. This paper does not take into account those types of institutional differences. It should be possible to get a measure that you can simply add to your model and actually add or interact with other variables to see whether the institutional arrangement actually helps shape your dependent variable. Similarly, your focus on arrests. Arrests point to the powerful role police play as agents of social control, but it's also pretty clear that that police don't just serve as agents of social control, but they also serve as agents of revenue extraction. The case of Ferguson looms large here. There's actually already work on the ground that takes this work into account. And I believe, scrolling through your paper, you already cite Sanses. Michael Sanses actually writes a paper in 2017 that deals with this phenomenon. You may at least want to cite that in your own work. And then because he finds that black representation on the city council actually moderates this relationship. And then finally, the work on representation is a bit more varied than you suggested. As it stands, your argument kind of proposes a top-down argument where it could be bottom-up. It could be that police have more political power in cities with more black council members, and as a result, are exerting more power as far as their preferences on policing. Now, the challenge, of course, here is that some black folk actually want policing, but those are a couple of the comments that I had. I'm looking forward to seeing this in print. The second paper, the Lanianu paper. This paper is actually, if I recall correctly, this paper is actually already out and in the world. So what I'll do is provide kind of a way that IO might want to move in the future. More broadly, and here I'm being a bit self-serving, I think you want to connect the policing dynamics to broader changes in the political economy. What's happening in the United States and Great Britain is not simply the new Jim Crow or the British equivalent of that, but it's also the neoliberal turn. This has effects on policing, on the welfare state, on labor unions, and through those dynamics, on the possibility for a social solidarity on the one hand and political participation on the other. But in as much as those dynamics have intra alongside interracial effects, see the comments I just made about Eckhouse, I'd spend, these effects may be complicated. I'd spend at least some time thinking through and writing about how these dynamics, how the neoliberal turn may be differentially shaping the countries under examination, not just around policing, but also around kind of labor and welfare. Remember that Sauce's work, which you cite, actually looks at welfare, but also looks at policing. Quant's work, which I believe you also cite, actually looks at welfare, but also looks at policing. One of the signal challenges scholars of racial politics have to wrestle with is the tendency to think about racial politics almost solely in parochial terms. This work helps us get out of that parochial American box, but it has to be a bit richer. That has to be a bit richer. Narrowly, you've already published a work suggesting somewhat counterintuitive findings, I believe. I'm surprised you didn't cite your own work and then use your own work to make a series of assumptions about the extent to which the effects you find carry over into other contexts. Secondarily, I think you really want to look at individual level measures. As the most important article in the field here, Vesta Weaver and Amy Lerman's works looms large. It looks at the effect of criminal justice contact on individual propensity to vote rather than aggregate propensity. And you recognize that there are challenges here. And then third, along these lines, and going back to kind of my broader point, the communities looked at in Amy Lerman and Vesta Weaver's paper are not only black, but they're poor. Although I think you run interaction effects, you really want to get a sense of how individuals in policed areas, you really not only want to get a sense of how individuals in policed areas interact with police, you'd also want to get a sense of how the state itself interacts with individuals in these spaces. And here I'm not just talking about police, but I'm talking about, things like welfare. We know that the UK has a more robust suite of social welfare policies than the United States do, but we also know that this is changing as a result of the neoliberal turn. How do these dynamics affect political participation? And then finally, we have Yanil Gonzalez's paper looking at policing into Latin American cities. This work is critically important, as in the U.S. and elsewhere. We are having conversations about how to effectively reform police, and in some instances, given the rise of the idea of police abolition, whether police reform is even possible. Gonzalez uses two cases, one in Colombia, one in Brazil, in which police did reform, but not in ways that significantly reduced police autonomy and corruption, in order to posit a dynamic model of policy change that, in effect, looks at those instances in which policies change, but policies don't really change. Although we know that crisis can spark enduring change, Gonzalez suggests that these and in other instances regarding the police, even when change occurs, change is slight. Of the three papers offered, Gonzalez's work has the most potential to help us think through change on the ground in the U.S. given the rise of Black Lives Matter. However, I'd suggest a few areas of work. While the neoliberal turn arguably begins in Chile in the early 70s, by the 90s we see it spread throughout Latin America. When Gonzalez writes of the new public management, what we're seeing is basically the neoliberalization of Latin American bureaucracy. So with the new public management literature talking about professionalization combined with actuarial metrics, combined with viewing citizens as consumers and public servants as service providers. The new public management philosophy is in general antithetical to democracy, at least a robust conception of democracy, as democracy viewed under public management is often inefficient. It seems to me that the idea of new public management itself can work as a constraint on the nature of police change. And Gonzalez's model neither allows for the role of ideology nor for the role of ideas necessarily as something that structures how we understand the nature of crisis and then how we understand the solution to it. How does the governing paradigm itself shape and constrain policies? Where is the independent role for ideas? Again, neither exogenous nor the endogenous forces you mentioned include them. Gonzalez, you argue that the police themselves end up pushing back against policy even when crisis exists, but the evidence for police as independent actors is limited, at least as in your paper. We know that the police get what they want. We know that they have their interests met, but how do we know that this comes from their actions as opposed to either another party, politicians, or to the general institutional framework that bakes police autonomy in? Even in the presence of crisis, if autonomy is baked in, institutionally speaking, we wouldn't expect that autonomy to be removed. And even if it's kind of temporarily removed, we wouldn't expect that to stick. And again, we can think of police working to make that not stick individually and having a dominant effect, but we can also think of other forces working to make that not stick. Maybe either on behalf of police, directly or on behalf of police indirectly. That is, they have a sense of what police want, even if police aren't articulating it and they just do it. On a somewhat related note, we have a sense of how people understand corruption and the police, but what role do media entities play in communicating and developing ideas about the crisis and about the solution? Also, kind of more broadly, why did you choose the cases that you chose? What are the similarities? What are the differences? It seems that you've got a national police force on one hand and state police on the other, although I could be misreading the paper. But are these differences important? Why did you just choose them because they happen to be particularly tough cases or they extreme cases? What's going on in the cases you chose? Also, you actually want to take this theory and apply it more broadly. Is policing a particularly tough case? Are there similar ones? And then finally, this is major and minor, and this is the one time I'll come back to the U.S. It seems to me that sex and policing, there's something about sex and policing that makes corruption involving those issues particularly pernicious in comparison to murder and other forms. That actually you don't necessarily have the space to deal with in this paper, and other people have kind of traced this dynamic. But I know there was something, one of the things that nobody's really talked about in relation to Black Lives Matter in the United States case is that we've got a number of instances, Detroit looms large, where we've got literally over 10,000 rape kits that have gone untested. In the Detroit case, they were literally found untested in a warehouse. And the response to that was basically charity, raising money to get those things tested. And it seems to me there's something about sexual violence and sexual assault that makes that a unique form of corruption that may be more intractable in some ways to deal with than violence and murder. So on that note, 15 minutes or a little bit over 15 minutes. I really wish I was there. I really hope to see some of you soon. I cannot wait to see this work in print. If you have any questions, you all have my email. And I hope you have a safe trip home, and I hope you had a wonderful conference. Peace.